China is not just the most populous country in the world, but also home to the largest English learning population. An estimated 400 million people are learning English in some form. That's bigger than the entire population of the United States. One foreign organization helped ignite the English learning fever, the United Nations Development Fund. 3 decades ago, the UNDP partnered with the Chinese government to introduce the first sets of English learning textbooks. And the main characters, by the name of Li Lei and Hanmeimei, became iconic for a few generations of young Chinese. How did these textbooks come about? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, on the 40 years of UN's presence here in China. I'm visiting a local school in western Beijing to find out how the UNDP has helped shape English learning and development in general in China. Virtually every Chinese born in the 1980s is familiar with Li Lei and Hanmeimei. These are the 2 fictional characters from the middle school English textbooks. Flat head shaved Li Lei, an honest little boy up. Short hair Hanmeimei, serious conservative, much like a woman director. As a result, Li and Han became icons, still emblazoned in the collective memory of those Chinese 30-somethings who have studied English all their lives. How do they remember these characters? Let's hear from them.
Well, it actually was a very classic book, English textbook, and then I was in the 7th grade, or maybe in the first year of junior school. Actually, that was the first English textbook I started to read, because we didn't have any English classes in the primary school, so we started learning English in the junior high school. So that actually was the first English textbook I came to read and started learning English. Well, definitely the characters of or the images of Li Lei or Hanmeimei actually left a deep impression on me, because while they were so lovely and cute, and they actually were so outgoing at the time, and for the boy or girls at age of 14 or maybe 15, they started to learn English, and it's the first time for them to know, wow, there are some foreigners, students who are actually can speak English in the middle class, and actually, and also the image of the English teacher, Miss Gao, also left us a deep impression, and she was so patient, and also she was nice and easy to get along well with.
Yes.
Yes, I've heard about it. No, I haven't.
Yes, of course not.
No.
Hanmeimei. Well, I heard about her actually.
There are 2 English book characters.
There are 2 characters in the English exercise book.
They are. I think they are from the textbooks of my mother's time.
I think there are 2 characters in a very famous old textbook of English. True friends, I believe.
I'm not sure about it. 2 friends or...
They were just beginning as a friend and later on became lovers, maybe.
And I think they are just classmates.
It's surprising that a series of textbooks can permeate the memories of an entire generation. What made this textbook so memorable and impactful? Our team traveled to the People's Education Press to talk to Professor Liu Daoyi, Chief Director of the Li Lei Hanmeimei series, who was there from the start. She told us how the project came into being in the 1980s and how teachers and students reacted to it.
At that time, the students tended to imitate and memorize the texts. So when they go out to meet foreigners, they were unable to communicate with them. So there was a strong voice for a reform in the ways of teaching English. Just in 1988, there was an agreement between the Chinese government and the UNDP. You know, at that time, the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic Exchange both supported us. Finally, we started our project in 1988. So the end of October, you know, Louis Alexander, our senior consultant, and also the author of New Concept English, and the father of Li and Hanmeimei, Neville Grant, came to China for the first time. We suggested some names, Chinese names. Of course, we thought Li, Hanmeimei, you know, sounds very easily, just like English. So Li, Hanmeimei, Jim Green, Kate Green, etc., including Polly, the bird. You know, after a few weeks of learning this book, the students could really say something meaningful. When they met foreigners, they dared greet them, you know, saying, "Hello, how are you? Nice to meet you." We were very pleased. Anyway, you know, they improved their ways of teaching, and the quality of English teaching increased substantially.
As more than 100 million Chinese students ultimately benefited from this series, it's no exaggeration to say that few textbooks had greater impact on that generation. How did such an influential project come to be? What was the UNDP's role in this process, and what else has UNDP achieved during its 40 years in China? I sat down with Mr. Devanand Ramiah, the UNDP Deputy Resident Representative in China. I started by asking him what the circumstances were more than 30 years ago when the project came into being.
UNDP was established here in the 1979 as one of the first organizations after the reform and opening up. And the 88 was the initial stage of our reform and opening up project experience. And then one of the parts of sustainable development is also high quality education. And this was a need that was collectively identified at that time by the government of China and UNDP in terms of enhancing the quality of English education. So we worked with the People's Education Press to enhance the quality of textbooks. But it has 2 or 3 steps, because it's not only about the textbook itself, it's about co-creating the textbook, it's about designing it to the Chinese context, it's about training teachers to teach the textbooks.
Yeah, and did you ever imagine the kind of the effectiveness of this whole textbook, and now especially looking at the kind of English speaking ability of the Chinese people, do you think the project achieved its initial goal?
Yes, definitely. I think it was a foundational cornerstone of English language education in China. I have colleagues in my own office who grew up in the 80s and 90s who fondly remember their times about this book. And if you look at them, they are working in an international organization and do have the necessary skill set when it comes to English as a language to work in an international organization. We have colleagues, Chinese colleagues, who are working internationally. And it has reached out to about 100 million people. So definitely, as China is developing and China is going out, and as a global role, the number of Chinese students who go to universities are increasing. Definitely, it's having an impact.
Yeah, these cooperative textbooks are just one example, whether symbolic or substantive. I think it's rather substantive, looking at the effectiveness of it. But it's just one example of the UNDP's role in China. So take us back to 40 years, looking back of all the projects that you have done. What were your role in China, and what do you think you have achieved in terms of boosting development in China in this very special period of time since China's reform and opening up?
China's development trajectory is historical, and UNDP is proud to have been part of this development journey over the last 40 years. So for instance, if you look at the 800 million people who have been lifted out of poverty, something that UNDP worked on in terms of poverty reduction, introducing the first inclusive finance and microcredit projects, focusing on poverty reduction policies, in introducing to China the concept of sustainable development. and we have worked on environment in bringing the balanced development, balanced growth, etc. So UNDP has contributed a lot, and we are proud of that journey because at the end of the day, China has achieved a lot and we have been part of it.
How do you describe China's trajectory of development over the past 40 years? I mean, you said historical, and yet help us understand a little bit better exactly what China's development means for not just China, but also the developing world and the world in general. I mean, 800 million people out of poverty is not just a problem solved, at least for the time being, for Chinese, but also for, you know, the Asia-Pacific region and possibly for humanity as a whole. And would you share with us some of the more striking moments, at least in the 1.5 years that you have witnessed here in China?
You're absolutely right. Because of China's size and scale, everything that China does has a global impact. So when it comes to poverty reduction, when it comes to green environmental related development, China has actually charted a path that lots of other developing countries can learn from. And what is unique is China has done it in its own way. It has learned, it has developed and adapted international practices to suit its context. And now one of the things that's coming out of it is that China is ready, as part of the South-South initiatives, to share some of these experiences externally. I have traveled to Gansu, I've traveled to almost 20 provinces in China. I've gone to the front lines of the development work, and I have seen what China is doing in terms of alleviating poverty, doing balanced development, which is really great, and examples that can be shared outside.
So how do you look at the role of UNDP here in China, now that China is kind of up on the, let's say, development chain, if I can coin that term here? Where do you see UNDP's position in the future here in China?
I think a doctor, for instance, a good doctor, the indicator of a good doctor is if the patient gets healed or goes home. So in that sense, UNDP as a development agency has a lot to be proud of in China, because China has achieved a sense of
So is the patient already recovered? I mean, is the doctor still necessary?
No, so while that is true, we have to be proud of there are new age development challenges that's coming on. How is automation going to impact on the structures of the economy, on the labor force? How is the aging population going to have an impact on the social security? How are we going to govern artificial intelligence? There are lots of the future that we don't know about, which I would call as new age development challenges. So I certainly think that the United Nations Development Program has a role with the government of China to deal domestically on some of these new age development challenges, including urban poverty, multidimensional poverty, but also the second part where China's global partnerships, where they really want to, like I explained, where Chinese experiences are going abroad. So we still have a role, but I would like to think that we have done most of our job.
You have done most of Well, I just saw this time in the UN headquarters, which says a central idea is development has no end to it. Yeah, you can always continue. Thank you so much, Mr. Devanand Ramiah, the Deputy Representative of UNDP here in China.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.